When listening to a gospel at a Sunday gathering, say a Sunday Eucharist, it might seem silly to ask what a gospel is. It seems so obvious. But a moment's thought shows that this is not the case. For one thing, we might think of the Gospels as biographies of Jesus, but they are far from that. We might think of them as attempts to bring us to belief in Jesus, but they're not apologetic. Likewise, they are not instructions on how to live one's life, but they do contain teaching. And while we think of them as inspired accounts of Jesus, there is no end of difficulties in trying to bring them into some sort of historical alignment. So is there a better way to approach the question, what is a gospel? Whenever we encounter a gospel passage, we need to recall that it invites us to interact with it on 6 interconnected levels: form, audience, story, history, myth, and task. These 6 levels are present, to a large extent, in every religious document, and they call forth a variety of answers. Furthermore, they open up to a deeper level of questions about whether we accept the document as worthy of belief. However, if we try to short-circuit these levels, as happens more often than not, we can end up in either an unthinking biblical fundamentalism or similarly unthinking rejection of the Gospels. Therefore, before we go any further, we should bear 2 points in mind. First, human beings have a bad habit of thinking that important information will be very simple in form. This is an attractive illusion because there are some very basic items of information and communication where this is true. Take the notice danger hot surface, for example. Here there is little or no ambiguity, a minimum amount of structure, just 3 words, and the effect desired is very clear, a warning. Take the even simpler communications of a stop sign on a road. This is a commandment that doesn't need interpretation or experts. You just obey it or else. There are many who imagine that God either does or should communicate in this way. But they might be less enthusiastic if we ask them to describe themselves completely in just 1 simple sentence. Life is complex and mystery is manifold. The religious texts in which we seek to communicate about the divine to one another are consequently always many-layered. Second, there is a curious unspoken alignment between those biblical fundamentalists who want to accept the book on their own terms and those who attack religion on the basis of ridiculing sacred books. Both want to determine on their own terms, in a clinical abstract fashion, what would constitute the modes of revelation. Sacred Scripture, therefore, operates as they say it should operate, and then it supports their view of what it should be. Either there is a God, formed according to their principles, who has produced the books, and it's all very simple, or there is no being matching what they say God should be, so the books are nonsense, and once again it's all very simple. However, if we approach the Gospel with the above set of 6 questions, it makes everything far more complex, but also it facilitates a reflective approach to some of the basic questions about belief that are thrown up by any religion that uses sacred texts. Let's start with form. Every human product that communicates between us has a form. Think of the difference between a lecture, a homily, a thought for the day on the radio, or a brief question and answer session. When we look at the Gospels, we see that they start at one time, then follow an individual day after day, and move on to death. All four Gospels do this, and perhaps onto the period after death, Matthew, Luke, and John. This forms the narrative of a life over time. Time's movement and an individual's life is what gives structure to the text. We today meet this structure when we read a biography, an obituary, or an encyclopedia entry when we need to look someone up. So can we say that the Gospels are biographies? Well, yes, in terms of form, a life following the sequence of time, but not in terms of task, because usually the task of a modern biography is to give us behind-the-scenes glimpses of the individual, or to probe their motivations and influences for the decisions they took in life, and most modern biographies are scrupulous in getting the sequence and times in correct order. It is worth noting that the first generations of Christians, our Gospels were composed between the late 60s and the early years of the 2nd century, used many forms in their literature. Biography in the Gospels, the form of a letter in the writings of Paul and several others, that of history in the book of Acts, that of a training manual in the Didache, that of a vision in the book of Revelation. And within these documents we have other forms such as hymns, such as Ephesians chapter 1 verses 3 to 10. It's important to remember this variety of forms, and there are many others, for it reminds us that we have to encounter them in different ways. In other words, we must not approach them as one sack, one sample, just because they're all in the Bible. Just as one respects the difference in what may be said in a personal email and a formal report, so we must respect the forms each document's creator chose. Given that we have 4 Gospels in the canon, 3 of them very similar, and fragments of many others, we can say that the Gospel was a very popular form in the early churches. By contrast, we know that there were collections of sayings of Jesus without this biographical form, but they did not survive in such quantity or popularity that they were later canonized. Their disappearance is easily explained. We all like following a narrative, the ups and downs of a life, especially one with a good storyline, and the 4 Gospels fit these criteria. But the Gospel of Thomas, which almost disappeared, does not. It takes the form of a collection of sayings. The second question is that of audience. In every communication, we make certain assumptions about who is going to receive it and how they are going to receive it. There are some things that are best done on television, others that are best done in a book. Some things can be said in an email, and some things need to be heard in person. A film of a play or a book is different, we all appreciate, from a live performance. The Gospels were intended to be heard, not read, by people who were already disciples of Jesus and who were gathering regularly with the community. They were not intended as introductions for people curious about the new religion, nor for preaching in the marketplace to see if someone might join the group. Most ancient writings were intended to be heard aloud, rather than be read silently as we usually read texts today. So we should think of these writings as more akin to a tape recording of someone's speech sent through the post, rather than as a variant on a modern book that is intended to be studied at a desk. We often refer to the gospel writers as if they sat in a library and wanted their book to be studied in the way that we want our books read. But this is the error of thinking they live in our world. The Gospels were composed to be encountered aurally, the ears listening to sounds, not by the eye scanning marks on a page. Moreover, they were to be heard in a group who heard them as their common narrative. So just as when in our school days we picked up a text of a play and read it, we were aware that reading Hamlet is not the same as seeing it, and seeing a film is not as good for understanding Hamlet as seeing a live play. Just so, we must think of a gospel as someone, the evangelist originally, giving a live recitation and with the group listening. Picking up a Bible and reading a gospel as if it were a report on Jesus' religious, ethical thoughts is just as alien to the author's expectation about his audience as reading Macbeth without at least imagining a stage and a packed auditorium. Everyone knows the difference between an expert's handbook on how a computer works and computing for dummies, though they share the same form, the training manual. The first assumes you already know a vast amount about the subject, the other that you know little, and indeed might be sceptical about the whole area. The Gospel's composers assumed that those who would hear them already knew a great deal about Jesus, the background of the Old Covenant, the group's way of life, what was expected of them, and that they had already chosen baptism and were committed to the group, assembled regularly for their meal at which they blessed the Father for what he had done in Jesus, and now wanted to recall the life, teaching, death and resurrection of the one they were following as Lord. So when they heard the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5 to 7, they had already learned much of it as simple instructions in a work such as the Didache, and had accepted it. When they heard that Jesus rose and appeared among his disciples on a Sunday, John 20 verse 1, verse 13, verse 19 and verse 26, they already accepted this, for this was the very reason that they were listening to the evangelist as part of the group. The Gospels were written by believers for believers. They are insider documents, not propaganda nor apologetics. Indeed, we have to wait until the middle of the 2nd century before we meet a text by a Christian that claims to be written for a non-Christian audience. Practically, this awareness of audience has profound implications. For example, it means that we should not expect that someone who rejects belief in God or Christianity would find the Gospels compelling. They were not written to satisfy the questions of such a person. Similarly, we have to think about how we imagine the Gospel's first audiences. Do we think of a gathering of believers for a meal, what would later be formalized into the ritual of the Eucharist, listening to a performance, or do we think of a small group sitting around reading Bibles which rest on their knees and discussing what the text might mean. When Christians do gather at the Eucharist and listen to the Gospel proclaimed, are they listening, or are each reading along in their own books? The question of audience is crucial. Get it wrong, and whether you're producing a television programme or encountering a gospel, the message will be lost or skewed. The third question is story. Every good biography, every narrative has a storyline, although in modern academic books there is often a lot of conscious effort to hide this fact. The storyline is the perspective that draws one into the document. It's about emotional involvement. It's about identity. When someone says that they do not like X's book on a subject, but do like Y's book on the same subject, what has often made the difference is the story. In most secular narratives, the storyline takes the form of being written from one side or another. Books from our side adopt a perspective. The other side's books have a bias. Clearly, books about the Second World War will have a different story if it's written from the Allies' side to that written from someone coming from the Axis' side. An American will be involved and involve the readers in a different way in his story of the Second World War to someone from Britain writing about 1940, or a Jewish writer considering the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto. The storyline is the key that draws you into the text. The composers of the Gospels assume that we are engaged emotionally with the Christ. He is not to be seen as just some distant figure or just some interesting teacher for his audience. Rather, the story is that of how he loved his disciples, taught them, and interacted with them. We are involved, and we appreciate just who we are as Christians when we hear them. And this level of involvement is essential to their message. The hearer is not intended to be unmoved by the Passion accounts, nor expected to stick up his hand during one of Matthew's set-piece sermons and blurt out, "But that is not consistent with what you said on such and such an occasion when you said something else." The hearer is expected to be drawn into the story, to identify with Jesus as the Lord, the Anointed One, in just the same way that we are drawn into a thrilling film. When sitting on the edge of our seat, we are anxious for the heroes of the tale to escape before the time runs out, which we can hear ticking in the background. This idea that the Gospels have a storyline is problematic for many people. We think that as soon as we detect a story, then the document is biased, compromised, useless. But the objectivity that such a rejection implies is wholly illusory. No one, not even someone from another planet, thinks or writes in such a way. Recall the last time you heard someone tell you an interpersonal conflict in which she or he was involved. If that person is a relative or friend, you will sympathise and accept. If you then hear the other party, you will be quick to point out that they have not got the story right, while a judge will invoke the legal principle of let the other side be heard. The Gospels were composed by disciples for disciples, and they expect you to be drawn in through recollection into the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, or in more theological language, to encounter the Gospels is part of entering the Paschal mystery. The fourth level is history. In any narrative, there are details of a life that can be authenticated, content that can be verified, and details that are simply true or false. Since we cannot rerun time, the key test we always use is that of the detail being possible. So, did Jesus meet a woman at the well? The test is this: could Jesus have met people? Yes. Did he travel? Yes. Could women be seen at wells? Yes. So the story of John 4:5-42 should not trouble us as to the plausibility of the meeting. However, history is never met in a document outside of form and audience. The biographer cannot relate everything, especially if the product is going to be presented orally, and there is a natural limit to the length of a gospel. And so the gospel's composer selected, and an audience will soon tire if there are umpteen bits that are summarized and seem to repeat one another. So the material has to be put together, grouped, boiled down, and given the variety of local colour. Moreover, the notes of explanation, the commentary, the background that creep in, these then tend to be either expanded, then shortened, so that the actual telling of the history is not a fixed element carved in stone. Tradition is dynamic, and each evangelist sought to improve his tale as communication and to adapt it to the understanding of his audience. So the sayings of Jesus that are found in what we call the Sermon on the Mount are found in a very different order, with very different emphases and contexts in Luke, and bits are found in other forms in Mark and John. So was there a Sermon on the Mount? Most probably not. But this is simply pointing out the editorial work of the evangelist Matthew is his own editorial work. It is his way of boiling down many things into a usable story. It's not to suggest that he is a fraud. Anyone communicating a complex narrative must use poetic historical license, just as any historical film must, so that the large picture of the life and death of Jesus can be told without the multi-volume work that John hints at when he says, "But there are also many other things which Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose the world itself could not contain the books that would be written." Lastly, every culture has its own style of writing history. Ours gives a premium to analysis over the repetition of details. And in the culture of the time in which the Gospels were composed, a good history was essentially an orderly one, as Luke tells us at the beginning of his Gospel. And indeed we are told that the style of the story must delight the ears of those who read it, as we see at the end of the second book of Maccabees. Therefore, we should expect that the evangelists have each put their own order on what may have come to them as just a jumble of facts and sayings, and then they've tried to make their historical narratives elegant as well. Because we have to sift out the editorial work of each evangelist, and note how details are altered in recollection and repetition, the work of establishing what we say about the historical Jesus is never an easy matter. While very few will ever learn the art of sifting historical details from historical narratives, and few will ever read their books, it's enough to note that while one cannot dismiss a detail or a whole gospel because it is contradicted in another gospel, and people have been attacking the gospels in this way since the middle of the 2nd century, likewise, one cannot simply assert that a detail is factually correct because it is not contradicted or because it is found in all 4 Gospels. For example, it could be a single editorial hand has established one pattern and it's followed by the other 3. The 5th layer is that of myth. No 2 questions are so often confused by those who encounter the Gospels than those concerned with history and myth. History is that which of its nature belongs to the normal world of our experience. It concerns what could happen to any human being up to the time of death and burial. Myth is everything else we hear in the Gospels. This is what does not belong to the world of normal expectation and includes healings, exorcisms, appearances of angels, feedings of the multitude, voices from heaven, and above all, the accounts of the resurrection, the appearances, and the ascension of Jesus. These are the parts of the gospel that the evangelist expects us to treat as different and other. We are to view them as uniquely related to the identity of Jesus, which flesh and blood has not revealed, but my Father in heaven, as Matthew puts it. We often try to explain away these parts as if they were just confused in memory by the early tradition. So, for example, to explain Jesus walking on the water as an illusion when he was actually on the shore. These rationalizations ignore the basic fact that the evangelist wants you to recognize that this is not an event belonging to the world of history, but is wondrous, miraculous, non-normal. Moreover, if someone who does not believe that Jesus is the Lord says that she or he finds such and such a story nonsense, it's no use arguing with that person. You can argue about a historical fact. For example, was Napoleon defeated at Waterloo? But about an event that claims as its basic quality to be beyond the bounds of history, such as an angel appearing to Mary, as recounted in the 1st chapter of Luke, this cannot be argued about historically. The question of audience is crucial. If you were listening to the evangelists when they were alive, you would have already made your commitment to Jesus as Lord and confessed that Jesus had risen from the dead, despite historical claims to the contrary, as found in Matthew 28, 12 to 15. It's from this perspective of commitment that you now hear these mythic events. And rather than asking whether or not you think them likely, the correct response to historical details, you view them as windows into the world that God has revealed and which is beyond our normal senses. Here the myths are expressed in terms we can imagine, but relate to events which we cannot encounter historically. Myth uses the elements of finite creation that we can envisage so that we can glimpse through these accounts the world beyond our imagining. trying to figure out these mythic elements as if we could make sense apart from the fundamental structures of discipleship is as vain as trying to fix a broken computer program with a hammer, a saw, and a few nails. Equally, it is useless trying to insist to someone who is not a disciple that they happened, for one cannot parallel them with historical experience. While with a disciple, it is a waste of time wondering if they happened, for the task is to see what they reveal about God and his Christ and their meaning for discipleship. Faced with a miracle story, our challenge is to discover what it tells us about God, who is greater than the creation and all our imaginings. The sixth level of question is that of task. The last question we approach in this sequence is task, and it is usually the very first concern of the composer of a text. Why compose this text in this way for this audience? The reason for some texts is very simple. The bill or the invoice, for example, is composed to show what has been done and how much the recipient owes to its sender. By contrast, it's very difficult to establish why someone has written a poem. Perhaps it's because the subject seemed too subtle for prose. Perhaps it's because the poet rejoices in beautiful language. Perhaps so that it can be put to music or easily remembered, or perhaps just for fun. Some books are written to communicate a body of facts and information. A good example would be a car maintenance manual. Some are intended to amuse us, a lot of novels, and others are written to persuade us that we should adopt an attitude or position on a topic. For example, a political manifesto, an advert, or a report showing that smoking is dangerous. The task of the Gospels seems so simple as not to require thinking, to tell us about Jesus, to persuade us to believe in him, or to give us a basic starting point of faith. However, when we think a little further, recall what we said about audiences and myth, we see that it is actually a very profound question. The audience already knew a great deal about Jesus, they already believed, and they belonged to a community that would show its members the way to live. So why did the evangelists travel around the churches retelling their long, elegant tales? Part of the answer lies in the title they gave them, Gospels. A gospel is a particular type of good news. Politically, it was a statement that the ruler had conquered his foes and that the city to which the gospel was addressed was now under the victor's protection. Declaring the good news was akin to a victory celebration and identified those taking part with the victor. In the case of the Christians, the good news was that the Lord had conquered and that his people, those listening to the evangelist, were safe under his protection, liberation, and love. Moreover, the act of gathering and hearing the gospel, and hearing that gospel as a proclamation, was not simply a study session or a performance, but was one of the ways that the risen Lord was present in the community. Just as the account went beyond history and revealed mythically the inner identity of Jesus, so retelling the story was not simply recollection, but encounter. To gather in his name and recall him was to have him present in their midst, as Matthew tells us in chapter 18, verse 20. We have texts from the early churches whose task was training, most famously the Didache, texts whose task was correction, Paul's letters to the Corinthians or the letter of Jude, formal instruction, Paul writing to the Romans, to establish links between all the churches, the Acts of the Apostles, and to offer encouragement. A good example would be 1 Peter. But in the Gospels, we have the task of offering in the recitation a means of encountering the Christ and embracing by the listeners his act of liberation, deliverance, redemption. It is this task of the Gospels that made them valued in a special way from the later 1st century onwards, and why they have, since their composition, figured in the weekly meal gatherings of the churches. Using these 6 questions to approach what is a gospel may seem a complex way of tackling one question, but it does have the advantage of generating significant answers to many questions that crop up when we listen to these core Christian texts today.